Hello, my grammar pals, and welcome to the English Weekly Review Session 3, which is going to be on reading comprehension. I would first like to start off with apologizing with the delay of the posting of this video. We actually did have this done before spring break of 2024. It just had some downloading issues and we weren't able to post it, so we're redoing it so you guys can get it now. So let's get into reading comprehension. First off, as always, you should visit the Tutoring Center at RVCC. We're located in the Bateman Student Center, all the way in the back by the athletic fields. You can make an appointment on our scheduling service, Academia, and follow the prompts. That can be an either in-person or online appointment, or you could also call 908-526-1200 at the extension 8549 or 8393. Whether you schedule an appointment, whether you walk in, we'll be more than happy to help you and we'll try to get you the help that you need and the time that you need. So here's what we're going to be going over this week. Reading comprehension is quite a bit because it's a little bit of a skill that you have to learn. So we're going to talk about why reading comprehension is important, tips for reading comprehension. I'm going to do an example of how to do reading comprehension with you guys. I'm going to go show you some worksheets that you can use that you can ask for in the tutoring center if you come, or that we can email you if you would like them. And then we'll go over some practice examples. So why is reading comprehension important? So it's very important because it shows that you understand what you're reading. It understands that you're not just letting the words in one ear and out the other. It means you're actually analyzing and understanding what you're seeing. So that's the first reason why reading comprehension is important. It's also important for achievement, for completing your goals. For school, it affects your academic performance because if you don't actually understand what you're reading, you're not going to be able to be tested on it. At work, it affects how well you perform your job. And in daily life, it means whether you can follow instructions, make informed choices. So it's important for achieving things as well, whether it's in your school, professional, or personal life. Next, it boosts critical thinking. Again, critical thinking is something you're going to be using in your school and your work, which means it's very important. And lastly, it gives you a path to independence and knowledge. You can't properly make choices and become an independent person if you don't understand things that are happening around you or things that you're reading. And it helps to expand your knowledge because you have all of this information that you're learning and analyzing. And usually if you analyze something, it has a higher chance of being in your brain. So moving on, we'll do some tips for reading comprehension. First, you should try to build on some existing knowledge. So for instance, if you're reading Jane Austen, that's set in a different time era, right? So you're going to want to try to learn more about the time and the era that that book is set in, built on the existing knowledge that you know is from a different era, and try to learn more about that different era. Next is to identify and summarize the key ideas. Oftentimes, what I like to do is if I'm reading and I need to do this, I write them down on a piece of paper as I'm going. It just makes less work for your brain, and it also puts it in a different place so you can keep on reinforcing that understanding. Next, use your online resources. This kind of entails with point number 1, which is building on existing knowledge. But if you don't understand a word, if you don't understand something that's being described, use the internet. It's there for a reason. It's there to help you. For instance, we'll go back to our Jane Austen example. There's a lot of things with courting, which was known as dating back then, in that book that may not be known, or societal roles that may not be known, or societal expectations that may not be the same as they are modern. So you might need to go online and look up the differences in society from then versus now. Next is develop your vocabulary skills. The bigger your vocabulary, the easier it is to understand different types of texts. Next, implement thinking strategies. So encourage critical thinking and analysis. What do you think will happen next? Why did the character make that choice? It gets you to engage with the material, which means you have more of an interest in the material, which means you analyze the material. Next, create questions and answer scenarios. So it's the same sort of thing as implementing thinking strategies. The thing that's helpful about creating question and answer scenarios, though, is a lot of the times your reading comprehension questions are going to be question and answer scenarios. So if you already are trying to do that as you're reading, you're probably going to have an easier time answering reading comprehension questions. Next, and this is not for everybody, but sometimes it helps if you're in a group setting to read aloud the story and discuss personal experiences. in our brain, we're forming pathways when we're learning. So if you're able to attribute a personal experience to something that's happening in the book, it's going to strengthen that neural pathway that you're forming when you're reading, which means you're going to have a higher chance of remembering it, which means you can have a higher chance of analyzing it. So attributing experience and the story is very important. Reading aloud just helps you to hear what you're actually reading so that you don't get kind of lost in just reading it without hearing it out loud. Next is be an active reader. This is very important. That's what I was kind of saying earlier. Jot down notes, underline key points. If it's a book that you can do that, if you can annotate text, do that. There's a lot of different things. If you go on internet websites like Pinterest and everything, that will show you different ways to annotate text. It's very, very helpful. It'll help you to engage more with your text, which means you'll be able to analyze it more. Next is understanding text structure. There are different types of text: narrative, expository, persuasive. If you understand the type of text you're reading, it's going to be easier to analyze it. Next is engage with your passage. In your brain, try to visualize the scenes, the characters, and the concepts that are going on. Remember, we're trying to form neural pathways by doing this in your imagination, picturing these characters and the concepts and scenes and the story in your head. You're creating a neural pathway. You're going to be able to play through it almost like a movie if you have to answer reading comprehension questions. And lastly, read quality articles. If you have to compare an article to an essay or literature, try to find something that's high quality content, which will help improve your understanding of what you're reading. So next we're going to do a walkthrough example. We're going to be reading this passage called Analyzing O Pioneers. So we can already tell from the first part, they're giving us a little bit of background about the story. I'll read the story out loud and then we'll try to answer the questions together. So Analyzing O Pioneers. Willa Cather's 1910 novel, O Pioneers, follows a Swedish family of farmers in Nebraska. In this passage, John Bergson is dying and worries about what will become of his wife and young children. Alexandra is the oldest Bergson child. Alexandra, her father often said to himself, was like her grandfather, which was his way of saying that she was intelligent. John Bergson's father had been a shipbuilder, a man of considerable force and of some fortune. Late in life, he married a second time, a Stockholm woman of questionable character, much younger than he, who goaded him into every sort of extravagance. On the shipbuilder's part, this marriage was an infatuation, the despairing folly of a powerful man who could not bear to grow old. In a few years, his unprincipled wife warped the probity of a lifetime. He speculated, lost his own fortune and funds entrusted to him by poor seafaring men, and died disgraced, leaving his children nothing. But when all was said, he had come up from the sea himself, had built up a proud little business with no capital but his own skill and foresight, and had proved himself a man. In his daughter, John Bergson recognized the strength of will and the simple, direct way of thinking things out that characterized his father in his better days. He would much rather, of course, have seen the likeliness in one of his sons, but it was not a question of choice. As he lay there day after day, he had to accept the situation as it was, and to be thankful that there was one among his children to whom he could entrust the future of his family and the possibilities of his hard-won land. So here are some suggestions I have just walking through this example. If you don't know a lot about the era of pioneers, I would definitely do research on that. There's a few words in here that aren't used in modern times, such as probity and folly and unprincipled. A lot of these words we don't know anymore. So if you don't know a word, it's not shameful to look it up. Always go onto the internet. I would look on Merriam and Webster's dictionary. Britannica is also a really good resource. Britannica is honestly probably the best for reading comprehension, in my opinion, because you can look up the history of what's happening as well as a definition. So now that we've read this example, let's move on to the question. So the question is, Alexandra shares personal qualities with her grandfather. What are these qualities and how will they help the Bergson family survive after her father dies? Cite text examples to support your ideas. So the question is, what are the personality traits that are similar that Alexandra possesses that are similar to her grandfather? I'm going to give you about a minute to look at the text again, read it through if you need to, go behind, rewind, and listen to it once more. And after a minute, let's reconvene and see an answer. So let's see what these answers could possibly look like. Remember, every answer will vary for reading comprehension because everybody could get different things out of a text. But these should be generally what you're seeing. Like her grandfather, Alexander is intelligent, possesses a strong will, and quote unquote has the simple, direct way of thinking things out. Alexandra's grandfather built a quote unquote proud little business with no capital. She will have to rely on the traits she shares with her grandfather, her intelligence and her strength of will to keep the farm after her father dies. So here are some of the worksheets that we have available at the Tutoring Center for you to be able to take notes based off of a reading comprehension assignment. So we have this one for finding articles for an informational text, and we have this one for a nonfiction article note-taking. And I always suggest the Cornell note-taking format, which is where you put a summary at the bottom, questions on the side, and then your notes in the middle. So we're going to be practicing reading comprehension skills now. So I'll read to you out loud the story, and then I'll give you a minute to take a look at the questions and try to formulate an answer that is answering those questions. Now, if you need to, please rewind and listen to the story as many times as you need to. Write down the question, another piece of paper if you need to. Do what you need to in order to answer these questions until it becomes like a skill that you have. So first we're going to start with this article called Mark Twain, How to Tell a Story. So we're going to give you some background info first. While Mark Twain wrote many fictional works, he also wrote nonfiction. Among his nonfiction works are his essays. Below is the beginning of his essay, How to Tell a Story, published in 1897. So something like this you might want to use our worksheet, the nonfiction worksheet, because it might help you be able to fill out those questions. So how to tell a story. I do not claim that I can tell a story as it ought to be told. I only claim to know how a story ought to be told, for I have been almost daily in the company of the most expert storytellers for many years. There are several kinds of stories, but only one difficult kind, the humorous. I will talk mainly about that one. The humorous story is American. The comic story is English. The witty story is French. The humorous story depends for its effect upon the manner of the telling, the comic story and the witty story upon the matter. The humorous story may be spun out to great length and may wander around as much as it pleases and arrive nowhere in particular. But the comic and witty stories must be brief and end with a point. The humorous story bubbles gently along, the others burst. The humorous story is strictly a work of art, high and delicate art, and only an artist can tell it. But no art is necessary in telling the comic and the witty story. Anybody can do that. The art of telling a humorous story, understand I mean by word of mouth, not print, was created in America and has remained at home. The humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects that there is anything funny about it. But the teller of the comic story tells you beforehand that it is one of the funniest things he has ever heard, then tells it with eager delight and is the first person to laugh when he gets through. And sometimes, if he has had good success, he is so glad and happy that he will repeat the nub of it and glance around from face to face, collecting applause and then repeat it again. It is a pathetic thing to see. So we have 4 or 5 questions related to this. Those questions are, to what country does Twain say the witty story belongs? What type of story must be long? Who can tell a humorous story? And what type of story does the teller repeat the end or nub? And is Twain talking about stories told out loud, printed stories, or both? So your minute will start now. So let's go over some of these answers. A lot of these answers should be similar because you're able to find them in the text. So to what country does Twain say the witty story belongs? France. What type of story must be long? The humorous story. Who can tell a humorous story? Only an artist. In which type of story does the teller repeat the end or nub? The comic story. Is Twain talking about stories told out loud, printed stories, or both? Stories told out loud. Next, we're going to move on to a bit of a more complicated one. In my opinion, this is the hardest one to read, not the hardest question, because it is from the 1700s. That's Abigail Adams, who was our second president, John Adams' wife. Very interesting woman if you ever want to do a project on an interesting first lady. But we will be reading Abigail Adams persuading her husband. So here's your background information. Abigail Adams' life was from 1744 was when she was born, and she died in 1818, was the wife of founding father and second president John Adams. While he attended the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1776, which by the way is where our Declaration of Independence came from, Abigail wrote to her husband often. Below is part of her letter from March 31st, 1776. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. So again, if you need to rewind to hear the story again to be able to answer this question, go right ahead. Regardless of which, I'm going to give you a minute to answer this question of what is Abigail trying to convince her husband to do? Give 2 examples of how she attempts to persuade him. So your minute will start now. So there's a minute. So let's go over what your possible answers could have. So Abigail Adams wants to convince her husband to include better treatment of women in the laws of the new country. She tries warning him of the results if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies. The women will start with their own rebellions. She also appeals to his common sense by saying men of sense in all ages abhor those customs. So I'm sorry for the blurriness of this. I couldn't really get a good picture of it, but we're going to be reading What's the Purpose? FDR's Pearl Harbor speech. In my opinion, this is the hardest question to answer. So we'll read a little bit of background information. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese aircraft and naval ships attacked the U.S. military at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Over 2,400 people were killed, and the U.S. lost a large number of ships and aircraft. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, which was broadcast to the American people. The text on the right is the beginning of his speech. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the empires of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to the Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. While this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the exeating diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. Again, if you need to rewind to hear the story to be able to answer this question, go right ahead. But from reading this passage, what do you think was the purpose of President Roosevelt's speech? I'm going to give you a minute starting now. So let's go over some of these possible answers. Correct answers can vary, of course, but possible answers may include 1. Roosevelt is condemning the attack on Pearl Harbor. 2. Roosevelt wants to go to war with Japan. 3. Roosevelt wants Congress and the American people to understand that the attack was planned in advance and was a surprise. If you'd like more examples to practice reading comprehension, you can always go to the website k12reader.com. That's where I got all the examples in this PowerPoint. We are not by any means sponsored by them, although we would love to be, but they are a really good free resource to use. So thank you very much for listening to today's session about reading comprehension. Again, I apologize, this is a little bit of an outdated slide because it was supposed to be before spring break, but the next video will be covering passive versus active voice. If you would like to, we do have these sessions in person. We'd love to see people start attending them. They're at Wednesdays at 1 o'clock through 2:20 on the third floor of the Bateman Center at the Tutoring Center. I hope you all had a great spring break and you're ready to get back into the semester. Hope you're doing well, Grammar Pals. Bye-bye.